My name is Arthur Callahan. For the majority of my 42 years, I have been a creature of the city. A man defined by the steady rhythm of deadlines, the incessant hum of traffic, and the artificial glow of 1,000 computer screens. I worked as a senior archivist for a metropolitan museum, a profession that, while quiet, was steeped in the constant pressure of preservation, cataloging, and the meticulous management of human history. My world was one of climate, controlled vaults, and the scent of aging paper. It was a life of precision, of order, and of a profound, soul-deep exhaustion. The decision to leave that world was not a sudden one. It was a slow erosion, a gradual wearing down of my spirit by the relentless pace of modern life. I found myself yearning for a silence that wasn't merely the absence of noise, but a presence in itself. I craved a darkness that wasn't simply a lack of light, but the deep, velvety black of a world untouched by electricity. I wanted, for the first time in my adult life, to be truly alone with my own thoughts. And so, after liquidating my modest assets and placing my professional life on an indefinite hiatus, I found myself applying for what many would consider a profoundly isolating position: a seasonal fire lookout for the U.S. Forest Service. The post was located deep within the sprawling, ancient heart of the Great Smoky Mountains, at a watchtower known simply as Thoroughfare Peak Tower. The interview process was surprisingly straightforward. A man named Ranger Davies, a portly fellow with a kind face and eyes that had seen more sunrises than I had seen late night television, seemed more interested in my psychological fortitude than my knowledge of fire suppression. "It's not for everyone, Arthur," he had said, leaning back in his creaky office chair, the scent of coffee and pine needles hanging in the air. The solitude, it can play tricks on a man. You spend weeks on end with no one but the hawks and the wind for company. You start to see things, hear things. Your mind tries to fill the silence. "I believe that's precisely what I'm looking for, sir," I had replied, my tone more confident than I felt. He nodded slowly, studying my face. "All right then. The post is yours if you want it. There's a bit of a unique protocol for this particular tower. The last fellow, a young man named Ben, left rather abruptly. Didn't even pack all his things. Said the place didn't agree with him." This gave me a moment's pause, but I dismissed it as the likely result of a city kid underestimating the reality of true isolation. I was not a kid. I was a man in search of quiet contemplation. I accepted the position. My journey to Thoroughfare Peak began a week later. The drive itself was a form of decompression. Paved highways gave way to state roads, which in turn narrowed into winding gravel tracks that clung precariously to the sides of mountains. The air grew cooler, cleaner, tasting of damp earth and pine. The last vestige of civilization was a small ranger station at the base of the mountain. However, where I was to meet another ranger who would guide me the rest of the way. His name was Earl, a man as weathered and sturdy as the ancient trees around us. He was tall and gaunt, with a leathery face and a grim set to his jaw that rarely softened. He drove an old, beaten, up Forest Service Jeep, and we ascended the final, rugged path in a series of bone-jarring lurches. So, you're the new archivist? He grunted, not taking his eyes off the treacherous track. He used the title of my former profession, not as a sign of respect, but as if it were a classification of a strange species. Former archivist. I corrected. Just Arthur now. He grunted again. Up here, you're just lookout. Names don't mean much. Actions do. We didn't speak much for the rest of the journey. The forest grew denser, the canopy of leaves so thick that it cast the path in a perpetual twilight. The silence was profound, broken only by the groan of the jeep's suspension and the occasional cry of a distant bird. It was exactly the kind of silence I had sought, yet it felt heavier, more watchful than I had anticipated. After another hour, the trees thinned, and we emerged into a clearing at the very summit of the peak. And there it was, Thoroughfare Peak Tower. It was a stark and lonely sentinel, a 90-foot, tall steel skeleton supporting a small square room at its apex. The steel was rusted to a deep, ruddy brown, and a single, dizzying spiral staircase wound its way up the exterior. It was both magnificent and terrifying, a fragile looking structure standing in defiance of the vast, rolling wilderness that stretched to every horizon. Earl killed the engine, and the silence rushed back in, absolute and all-encompassing. Home sweet home, he said, without a trace of irony. We unloaded my supplies, boxes of non-perishable food, containers of water, books, and personal effects. Earl carried a heavy, looking pack of his own. We then began the long climb up the staircase. The wind picked up as we ascended, whistling through the steel girders and making the whole structure sway in a way that was deeply unsettling. I kept my eyes fixed on Earl's boots, not daring to look down. The room at the top, the cab, was a single 14 by 14-foot space enclosed on all four sides by large glass windows. In the center stood a circular map table, upon which was a detailed topographical map of the surrounding region, oriented and anchored under a glass plate. An Osborne firefinder, a complex brass instrument for pinpointing the location of smokes, sat upon it. Against one wall was a small cot, neatly made. Against another, a counter with a propane stove and a small sink. A short wave radio sat in one corner, its microphone hanging silently. And in another corner, a trapdoor in the floor, leading back down to the terrifying staircase. The view was breathtaking. A 360-degree panorama of the Smoky Mountains, an endless ocean of green and blue ridges, fading into a hazy, distant purple. It was a vista of raw, primordial beauty. For a moment, I felt a profound sense of peace. "All right, look out," Earl said, his voice pulling me from my reverie. He unslung his pack and pulled out a few items, a fresh logbook, a box of batteries for the radio, and a single, laminated sheet of paper. "You know the basics," he began, his tone all business. "Your job is to watch for smoke. You see any? You use the firefinder to get a bearing, estimate the distance, and radio it in to base. The radio is for official use only. Weather reports at 0800 and 2000 hours. You check in then, every day. They'll check on you if you miss one. A supply team comes up once a month. Any questions on that? No. That seems clear? Good." He paused. then pushed the laminated sheet across the map table toward me. It was typed. The letters faded slightly. The plastic yellowed at the edges. It looked old, handled by many anxious hands. "Now for the other stuff," he said, his voice lowering slightly. "The tower's protocols. Ben, the kid before you, he thought they were a joke. He didn't last a week. You're an older fellow, a man of procedure. I'm hoping you'll have more sense." I picked up the sheet. The title was stark. Tho Rofar Piectowar Min Toar Operatin Rallis. I read the first rule. 1. The tower is to be occupied at all times. Do not, under any circumstances, leave the cab and descend the stairs between sunset and sunrise. No exceptions. I looked up at Earl. Seems a bit extreme. What if there's an emergency? There won't be, he said flatly. Not one that requires you to go down those stairs in the dark. I returned my gaze to the list. 2. You will see smoke that is not from a fire. You will see smoke that is the wrong color, blacker than pitch, or the color of a fresh bruise. You are to report all smokes, but note the unusual ones in the logbook with a single asterisk. Do not speculate on their source over the radio. Wrong color smoke? I asked, a small knot of confusion tightening in my stomach. You'll know it when you see it, Earl said, his face unreadable. Just log it. 3. The forest is not quiet. You will hear sounds. If you hear something that sounds like a person calling your name, you did not. It is the wind playing tricks in the valleys. Do not answer. Do not acknowledge it. My mouth was suddenly dry. I thought of Ranger Davies's warning. Your mind tries to fill the silence. This rule felt different. It was too specific. 4. The radio is for scheduled communications only. If you receive a call outside of the 0800s or 2000 check-ins, do not respond. This is especially true for calls received after midnight. It is not the ranger station. Who would it be? I whispered, the question feeling foolish as soon as I asked it. Earl just shook his head. Doesn't matter who it is. What matters is that you don't answer. I forced myself to continue reading, a sense of unreality beginning to creep over me. This felt less like a set of safety protocols, and more like the rules to a game I didn't understand. 5. From time to time, you may observe a sequence of lights hovering over the ridge to the north, known as Old Crow's Ridge. They may be bright and multicolored. Do not look at them directly. Observe them only through your peripheral vision. Do not log them. Do not report them. They are a localized atmospheric phenomenon. Localized atmospheric phenomenon. I read aloud, my voice laced with skepticism. That's not a scientific term. It's the term we use, Earl said, his tone leaving no room for argument. The list went on, each rule stranger and more unnerving than the last. 6. If, while scanning the tree line, you see a stationary human figure standing at the edge of the woods, do not stare at it. Avert your gaze. Continue your scan as normal. It will not be there when you look back. It is a trick of the light. 7. On the third night of your stay, and every third night thereafter, you must lock the trapdoor at the bottom of the stairs before sunset using the heavy bolt. You will hear knocking. You may hear scratching. You may hear pleading. You are to ignore it until sunrise. The bolt must hold. A cold dread, sharp and piercing, shot through me, pleading, "Earl, what the hell is this? Is this some kind of hazing ritual for new lookouts?" For the first time, Earl's grim facade cracked. He looked at me, and in his eyes I saw not malice or amusement, but a deep, wary pity. "I wish it was, son. I truly do," he said softly. "I've been with the service for 35 years. I've seen things in these mountains that don't make sense. Things that don't follow the rules of the world you and I know. This tower, this peak, it's one of the places where the rules are thin. That list," he tapped the laminated sheet, "is how you survive here. The rules are not suggestions. They are absolutes. You break them, and I'll be driving another replacement up here in a week. If we're lucky enough to find what's left of you to replace." The finality in his voice was absolute. This was not a joke. He gathered his empty pack. "My advice, Arthur, don't try to understand it. Don't try to rationalize it. Just accept it. Do your job, follow the rules, and you'll be fine. You'll see some beautiful sunrises." He moved to the trapdoor. "I'll be back in a month with your supplies. Radio in at 2,000 hours. And with that, he was gone, his heavy boots clanging on the steel steps, the sound growing fainter and fainter, until it was swallowed by the wind. A few minutes later, I heard the distant groan of his Jeep's engine, and then nothing. I was alone. I stood in the center of the cab for a long time, the laminated sheet clutched in my hand. The sun was beginning its slow descent, painting the western sky in brilliant strokes of orange and crimson. The beauty of it was immense, but now it was tainted by a creeping sense of menace. The shadows of the mountains stretched and deepened, and the endless sea of trees began to look less like a forest and more like a dark, waiting ocean. I was a man of logic, of archives and evidence. My mind desperately sought rational explanations. The rules were a psychological test, a prank, the product of a lonely man's madness, passed down through generations of lookouts. But Earl's sincerity had been undeniable. As the last sliver of the sun disappeared, below the horizon, plunging the world into a deep twilight, I walked over to the trapdoor and looked down the spiral staircase. The world below was a pit of ink. I thought of Rule Fate 1. With a trembling hand, I closed the heavy trapdoor, the sound echoing in the small cab. I turned and faced the windows, my own pale, anxious face reflected in the glass. Outside, the Smoky Mountains sat in an ancient, profound silence, and I had the distinct and terrifying feeling that I was being watched. The first night had begun. The first 48 hours passed in a state of hyper-vigilant routine. My life, once dictated by the chime of email, notifications, and the rigid schedule of museum hours, found a new, more primal rhythm. It was governed by the rising and setting of the sun, the slow sweep of my binoculars across the endless canopy of trees, and the crackle of the radio at precisely 2,000 hours. During the day, the tower felt like a sanctuary. The sun would burn away the morning mist, revealing the staggering, breathtaking beauty of the Smokies. I was an emperor in a glass castle, monarch of all I surveyed. I followed my duties with the same meticulous precision, I had applied to cataloging ancient artifacts. I would make a slow 360-degree scan of the horizon every 15 minutes, my eyes tracing the ridges and valleys for the faintest whisper of smoke. I made notes in the fresh logbook Earl had provided, detailing wind speed, cloud cover, and visibility. The entries were crisp, professional, and utterly devoid of the yawning anxiety that took root in my soul the moment the sun began to dip below the horizon. Night was a different entity altogether. When darkness fell, the glass walls of the cab ceased to be windows onto a majestic world. They became mirrors, reflecting my own solitary, haunted face with a vast, unknowable blackness pressing in from all sides. The profound silence I had craved became a physical weight. Every creak of the steel tower in the wind, every skittering sound on the roof that was likely just an insect or a fallen leaf, became amplified, imbued with a sinister intent. I slept fitfully on the small cot, the laminated list of rules on the small table beside me, a talisman against the encroaching dread. I tried to rationalize the rules, to file them away in the logical cabinets of my mind. Rule 51, not leaving after sunset, was simple prudence. A fall from that height in the dark would be fatal. The others were surely the products of isolation-induced paranoia, codified and passed down as a kind of morbid tradition. Tricks of the light, the wind playing games in the complex topography, the mind's desperate attempt to create patterns from chaos. This was the narrative I clung to. It was a thin blanket against a bone, deep chill. The first test of my resolve came on the afternoon of the second day. I was scanning the eastern quadrant, a vast expanse of old-growth forest. The sky was a brilliant, cloudless blue. And then I saw it, a plume of smoke, rising from a deep valley about 10 miles out. I reached for the radio, my training kicking in, but then I paused. I focused my binoculars on the smoke, and my blood ran cold. It was the wrong color. It wasn't the gray or white of a typical forest fire, nor the greasy black of a chemical fire. It was a sickening, bruised purple, the color of a deep contusion. It didn't drift and dissipate on the wind. It pulsed, coiling and uncoiling in the air, like a malevolent serpent of vapor rising from the depths of the forest. My mind recoiled. It was impossible. Smoke did not behave that way. It did not hold that color. I remembered Rule 8-2. You will see smoke that is not from a fire. Report all smokes, but note the unusual ones in the logbook with a single asterisk. My hand trembled as I keyed the microphone. Thoroughfare peak to base, over. The familiar, grounding voice of Ranger Davies crackled back. Go ahead, Thoroughfare. We read you. Base, I have a smoke sighting. Bearing 290 degrees from my position. Estimated distance 10 miles. I described the location, my voice a mask of calm professionalism. I did not mention the color. I did not mention the way it seemed to breathe. Copy that, Thoroughfare. We'll send a spotter plane to check it out. Good eye, Arthur. Thoroughfare, clear. I hung up the microphone, my body slick with a cold sweat. I turned to the logbook. With a shaking pen, I recorded the time, the bearing, and the estimated distance. And then, next to the entry, I drew a single, small asterisk. It seemed to stare up at me from the page. A tiny black star of wrongness. I spent the rest of the day watching the purple smoke. It never spread. It simply pulsed in place for 3 more hours before slowly, inexplicably, sinking back down into the trees and vanishing, if it had never been. The spotter plane reported nothing. That night, sleep offered no escape. My dreams were of coiling, purple tendrils and the suffocating scent of decay. I awoke just before dawn to a new sound, one that was not on the list. A soft, rhythmic tapping. It was coming from the glass of the window directly behind my head. Tap, tap, tap. Slow, deliberate, patient. I froze, every muscle in my body screaming. I was 90 feet in the air. Nothing could be tapping on my window. A bird, I told myself. A large moth drawn to the faint light of my lantern. But the sound was too heavy, too intentional. Tap, tap, tap. I remembered Earl's advice. Don't try to understand it. Just accept it. I squeezed my eyes shut, pulling the thin blanket over my head. I focused on the sound of my own frantic heartbeat, using it to drown out the impossible tapping from the other side of the glass. It continued for what felt like an eternity, before finally fading away with the first gray light of dawn. I did not look to see what, if anything, was there. The morning of the third day dawned gray and oppressive. A thick fog had rolled in overnight, blanketing the world and reducing my visibility to less than 50 feet. The tower felt like an island in a sea of nothingness. The isolation was now absolute. It was on this morning, while searching for something to distract my frayed nerves, that I found the old logbooks. They were stored in a wooden chest beneath the cot. There were 5 of them, their leather covers cracked and faded. The most recent one, on top, was Ben's, the young man who had left in a hurry. His entries began much like my own, neat, professional, full of observations about the weather and the stunning beauty of the landscape. Then, about a week in, the tone began to shift. October 3. Saw the bruise smoke today. Called it in. Davy said the plane saw nothing. I know what I saw. Put the star next to it, like the old-timer said. A few pages later, October 6. Third night. Locked the door. The knocking started right after sunset. It's not the wind. It sounds like knuckles on wood. I'm trying to read, but the sound is distracting. His handwriting grew more erratic. October 9. It was pleading tonight. Used a little girl's voice. Said she was lost and cold. I almost opened the door. God help me, I almost did. The bolt held. October 10. There was a man at the tree line this morning. Just standing there. Rule Phase 6. Didn't stare. Looked away, scanned the ridge. Looked back. He was gone. But I can still feel his eyes on me. He wasn't made of light. He was real. His final entry was a frantic scrawl covering half a page. October 12. IT Kaladimion Techi Radio. Now to device. The vice was WRNG. Day up. Tuokmayenea. IKEMMY star. Ho keldi ITK no ABOUMY I star. I'm a VNG. I'm a VN Nambu. I daf I test IHT. I kind of star in EGHT. Do and I sta tutu HE radio intermedian IGHT. IT satra. T say elbuya Y say trap. I slammed the book shut, my heart hammering against my ribs. It was all real. Every insane, impossible rule was a literal warning. Ben hadn't been a weak city kid. He had been a man who had stared into the abyss and fled. I spent the next hour reading entries from the older logbooks going back decades. The stories were all the same, written in different hands but telling a single, consistent tale of wrong, colored smoke of disembodied voices, of lights on Old Crow's Ridge, and of the terrible, cyclical knocking on the third night. As the afternoon wore on, the fog began to thin, but the sky remained a leaden gray. The world outside was muted and colorless. A profound sense of dread settled over me. Today was my third day. Tonight was my third night. I remembered Rule Phase 7. On the third night of your stay, you must lock the trapdoor at the bottom of the stairs before sunset, using the heavy bolt. My earlier confusion about the rule's wording now seemed like a cruel joke. There was no trapdoor at the bottom of the stairs. There was only the heavy steel door that provided the only entrance to the tower's base. And there was the trapdoor in the floor of the cab, my only way down. The rule was a contradiction, a choice. Did I break Rule 81 and descend the stairs to lock the bottom door, exposing myself to whatever was out there? Or did I stay in the cab, assuming the rule meant the trapdoor right here, and hope that was enough? I looked at the heavy bolt on the trapdoor in the floor. It was thick, rusted steel. It looked like it could hold against a battering. Then I looked at the logbooks, at Ben's frantic warnings. He had locked the door. Plurality suggested he meant the one in the cab. That had to be it. The rule was poorly phrased, but its intent was clear: secure your immediate location. Going down was suicide. As the sun, a pale, sickly disk in the gray sky, finally touched the horizon, I made my decision. My hands, slick with sweat, fumbled with the bolt on the trapdoor in the floor. It was heavy and stiff from disuse. With a final, desperate heave, I shot it home. The solid thunk of the steel bolt, seating in its iron bracket, was the loudest, most final sound I had ever heard. I was sealed in. I made my 2,000 hours radio call, my voice tight but steady. Ranger Davies wished me a quiet night. I wished I could believe him. I tried to read, but the words swam before my eyes. The cab grew cold, the propane lantern casting long, dancing shadows. The silence outside was absolute, the fog having muffled all the normal sounds of the forest. It was a dead, waiting silence. And then it began. It started not as a knock, but as a faint, rhythmic scratching. It came from directly below, from the other side of the trapdoor. Scryape, scrape, scryape. It was the sound of fingernails, or perhaps claws, being dragged slowly and deliberately across the thick wood. My breath caught in my throat. I backed away from the trapdoor, my eyes wide with terror, pressing myself into the far corner of the cab. The scratching stopped. For a long, heart-stopping moment, there was only silence. Then came the knocking. Knuk, seek, knoke. It was not the sound of human knuckles. It was heavy, solid, powerful. Each impact vibrated through the floor, up my legs, and into my teeth. It was a sound of immense strength and implacable will. It wanted in. I stared at the heavy bolt on the trapdoor, praying to a God I hadn't spoken to in years that it would hold. The knocking stopped again. A new sound filled the silence. A voice, A sweet, high-pitched voice of a little girl, muffled by the door. "Mister, can you let me in? I'm lost, and I'm so cold." My blood turned to ice. It was exactly as Ben had written. My mind screamed at me. It's a trick. It's not real. Rule Phase 7. Ignore it. But the voice was so pathetic, so filled with genuine terror, that a sliver of doubt, a shard of my former rational self, pierced through my fear. What if it was real? What if a child had somehow wandered up this mountain? "Please," the voice cried, now with a desperate sob. "My daddy went to find help, but he's been gone so long. I can hear things in the woods. Please, just open the door." The pleading tore at me. It was the most terrible sound I had ever heard. I was a man of procedure, of rules. And the rules were the only thing keeping me alive. I squeezed my eyes shut, my hands over my ears, but I could not block out the sound of the child's weeping from beneath my feet. And then the voice changed. The sweet, childish pleading warped, dropping in pitch, becoming guttural, monstrous, and filled with an ancient, bottomless rage. "I know you or there," it boomed, the sound so powerful it shook the very glass in the windows. "O pentichesto archivist. Lewit me co The voice, that booming, cavernous voice that called me archivist, shattered the last vestiges of my rational mind. It was a sledgehammer to the foundations of my reality. Terror, pure and undiluted, is a surprisingly clarifying emotion. In that single moment, all my attempts to explain away the rules as psychological quirks or morbid traditions evaporated. This was not a trick of the wind. This was not a product of my own isolated mind. There was something beneath my feet, something ancient and intelligent, and filled with a rage that felt as old as the mountains themselves. And it knew me. That was the detail that unspooled my sanity. How could it know my former profession? I had been Arthur Callahan, senior archivist, for 2 decades. It was a title, a definition, a box I had placed myself in. The voice used the word archivist, not as a job title, but as an accusation. And its demand, LTMESCEOURS was nonsensical and yet terrifyingly specific. My collection was of dust and paper, of carefully preserved historical documents, locked away in a climate-controlled vault hundreds of miles away. What could this creature possibly want with that? The booming voice did not speak again, but the knocking resumed with a renewed, terrifying violence. It was no longer a simple K-ok, K-no-seek, K-no-seek. It was a frantic, furious pounding that shook the entire tower. The floor beneath my feet vibrated with each blow, and I could hear the steel frame of the structure groaning in protest. The propane lantern flickered wildly, casting my spastic shadow against the glass walls. I was a caged animal, and the predator was trying to smash its way in. I scrambled to the farthest corner of the cab, curling into a fetal position with my hands clamped over my ears. It did little to block out the concussive impacts from below. I squeezed my eyes shut and began to recite the only things I could think of that represented order and logic. Archival cataloging numbers, the Dewey Decimal System, the chemical formulas for paper preservation. It was a litany of a life that no longer existed, a desperate prayer to the God of reason. in a place where reason had died. The assault on the trapdoor continued for hours. It was relentless. Just when I thought it was beginning to fade, it would return with even greater fury. I lost all track of time, adrift in a sea of pure terror. The only thing that mattered was the integrity of the thick wooden door and the rusted steel bolt that held it shut. I prayed it would hold. I prayed for the dawn. And finally, after an eternity of noise and fear, the first gray, watery light of morning began to seep over the eastern ridges. As the light grew, the violent knocking subsided, replaced once more by the soft, insidious scratching. The scratching continued for another 10 minutes, a final, hateful promise, before it too faded away into silence. Silence, it was no longer a thing I craved. It was a void. A space where the horror had been and could return at any moment. I remained huddled in the corner for a full hour, after the sun had risen, too afraid to move. The fog from the previous day had burned off. The world outside was painfully beautiful, the valleys filled with a soft, white mist that looked like freshly fallen snow. It was a world that should not, could not, contain the thing that had tormented me all night. Eventually, trembling and exhausted, I forced myself to my feet. My legs were stiff, my muscles screaming in protest. I crept towards the trapdoor, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I knelt, my ear pressed against the wood. Nothing. Only the faint whisper of the wind outside. With a shaking hand, I reached for the bolt. It was still firmly in place. I slid it back, the sound of metal on metal grating in the quiet cab. I hesitated for a long moment, my hand on the iron ring that served as a handle. What if it was waiting just below? What if opening the door was the final mistake? But I had to know. I had to see. I lifted the trapdoor an inch and peered through the crack. Nothing but the top steps of the spiral staircase, lit by the morning sun. I opened it fully and looked down. The staircase was empty. The steel door at the base of the tower was closed. There was no sign of anything amiss. But then I looked at the trapdoor itself. The underside, the thick oak that had faced the assault, was a ruin. It was covered in deep, gouging scratches, not the thin lines of fingernails, but the thick, splintering furrows that could only have been made by something immensely strong and sharp. And in the center of the door, where the knocking had been most focused, the wood was dented and cracked, the fibers crushed inwards. Physical evidence, undeniable proof. My rational mind, the archivist within me, seized on it. This was real. This happened. And the rules were the only thing that had saved me. The next 2 days were a blur of fearful vigilance. I was no longer a man seeking quiet contemplation. I was a prisoner on watch duty. I performed my scans, logged the weather, and made my radio check-ins with a mechanical, robotic precision. But my mind was elsewhere. It was replaying the sounds from the third night. It was contemplating the impossible, knowledge the creature possessed. My relationship with the tower had fundamentally changed. It was no longer a sanctuary. It was a cage, suspended 90 feet in the air, and I was the bait. The vast, beautiful wilderness was no longer a landscape of primordial beauty. It was a hunting ground, and I was the prey. On the afternoon of the 5th day, I experienced another rule firsthand. I was scanning the tree line to the south, the sun warm on the glass. My eyes were tired, my nerves raw, and then I saw him, just as Rule 86 had described. A stationary human figure, standing at the very edge of the woods, partially obscured by the trunk of a massive pine tree. He was too far away to make out any details, even with the binoculars. He was just a silhouette, a man-shaped patch of darkness, against the dappled green of the forest. My immediate instinct was to stare, to focus my binoculars and try to identify him. A lost hiker, perhaps. A hunter. But Ben's frantic scrawl echoed in my mind. He wasn't made of light. He was real. And the cold, imperative text of the rule: do not stare at it. Avert your gaze. Continue your scan as normal. It will not be there when you look back. My heart hammered in my chest. Every instinct screamed at me to keep watching, to assess the potential threat. But the memory of the splintered trapdoor was still fresh. The rules were not suggestions. They were survival commands. With a supreme act of will, I forced myself to move the binoculars, to continue my scan to the left, away from the figure. My hands were shaking so badly that the image through the lenses was a blur. I swept my gaze across the next ridge, my mind screaming. I counted to 30, the seconds stretching into an eternity. I noted a hawk circling on a thermal. I logged it. Normal scan. Everything is normal. Then, with my stomach in a tight, cold knot, I slowly panned back to the spot where the figure had been. It was empty. There was only the pine tree and the deep shadows of the forest behind it. He was gone. There was no way a person could have moved that quickly, that silently, without my seeing. It was as if he had simply been erased from existence. But I knew he had been there. And worse, I had the chilling, unshakable feeling that he knew I had seen him. The feeling of being watched, which had been a constant, low-level hum of anxiety, was now a piercing shriek in the forefront of my mind. That night, I didn't even try to sleep. I sat at the map table, the lantern turned down low, staring out into the blackness. The 6th day was approaching. The second cycle of the 3rd night. The dread was a physical thing, a sour taste in the back of my throat. Would it be the same? The scratching, the knocking, the little girl's voice? Or would it escalate? The logbooks had been consistent, but they were also records of men who had survived. What about the ones who hadn't? What had they experienced? As the sun set on the evening of the 6th day, the sky was a bloody, bruised red. It felt like an omen. I performed my ritual. I made my 2,000 hours radio call, my voice a strained whisper. And then, with a sense of grim ceremony, I shot the heavy bolt on the trapdoor. The thunk of the steel was no longer a comfort. It was the sound of a tomb being sealed. I waited. The silence in the cab was absolute. An hour passed. Then 2. Nothing. A sliver of hope, fragile and foolish, began to grow in my chest. Maybe it only happened once. Maybe, having failed, it had moved on. And then the radio crackled to life. My head snapped towards it. It was 2247. Not a scheduled check-in. My blood ran cold. Rule Fay 4. If you receive a call outside of the 0800 or 2000 check-ins, do not respond. This is especially true for calls received after midnight. It wasn't after midnight yet. A part of my mind, the desperate, hopeful part, clung to that detail. Maybe it was a real emergency. Thoroughfare Peak, this is base. Arthur, do you read me? Over. It was Ranger Davies's voice. It sounded exactly like him. The same calm, reassuring tone. But there was something wrong. A faint, almost imperceptible hiss underneath his words, like static, but wet. I stared at the microphone, my hand hovering over it. Ben's warning screamed in my head. IT Kaladion Hirato. THV Dasuranji. Arthur, please respond. The radio crackled again. We have a situation. Earl, there's been an accident. He was coming up to check on you. His Jeep went off the road. We need to know if you saw anything. Over. My world tilted. Earl, an accident. A wave of guilt and fear washed over me. What if this was real? What if my silence condemned him? But the rule was absolute. I stayed silent, my knuckles white as I gripped the edge of the map table. A long pause. Then, the voice from the radio spoke again. The calm, reassuring tone was gone. It was replaced by a low, mocking chuckle. The wet, hissing static grew louder. Oh, Arthur. The voice, no longer Davies's, crooned. It was the same deep, resonant voice from beneath the trapdoor. The good little archivist, always following the rules. But rules can be rewritten. Collections can be recatalogued. And then, from the radio, it began to speak of things it could not possibly know. It spoke of my quiet, lonely childhood. It spoke of the day my father left, the memory I had buried for 30 years. It described the pattern on the wallpaper in my childhood bedroom. It was inside my head. It was pulling the memories out, one by one, like artifacts from a dusty box, examining them, and then holding them up to mock me. I stumbled back from the radio, a strangled cry escaping my lips. And as I did, the scratching began on the trapdoor below my feet, louder this time, more frantic. And from outside, from the inky blackness beyond the glass, I heard a sound that made my soul turn to ice. It was the sound of a single, heavy footstep on the steel staircase just below the cab. Sealange. It was climbing. The sound was a physical blow. It was the sound of finality, the tolling of a bell for my sanity. My carefully constructed reality, already fractured and splintered, shattered into a million pieces. The scratching below. The mocking voice from the radio. They were distractions, a multi-pronged assault designed to paralyze me. The true threat was no longer trying to get in. It was already here. It was on the stairs. My breath hitched in a silent scream. I scrambled backwards, my back hitting the cold glass of the northern window. My eyes darted wildly between the trapdoor. Now, vibrating with the furious scratching from whatever remained below, and the radio, which had fallen silent, its malevolent work done. But my hearing was focused entirely on the outside. Sealang, another step, slower this time, heavier. The sound of steel groaning under a weight. It was never designed to bear. It was a deliberate, measured tread. The sound of a predator that knows its prey is cornered. There was no rush. It had all the time in the world. I was in a glass box, 90 feet in the air. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. My former life, the quiet, ordered world of the archivist, seemed like a dream I'd once had. That man was gone. In his place was a terrified animal, heart hammering, every nerve ending screaming, "See, Laman." It was higher now, maybe halfway up. The entire tower swayed with each step, a slow, sickening motion. I gripped the frame of the window to steady myself, my knuckles white. The voice on the radio had burrowed into my mind. But this was a more primal fear. This was the fear of being physically torn apart. I had to look. I couldn't just wait here in the dark, listening to my doom approach. I had to see what was coming for me. With a surge of adrenaline, fueled desperation, I crawled towards the western window, the one overlooking the top of the spiral staircase. The scratching from the trapdoor intensified, as if sensing my movement. Angry that my attention was shifting, I pressed my face to the cold glass, my breath fogging a small patch before me. I peered down into the inky blackness. At first, I saw nothing but the faint, skeletal outline of the stairs against the star-dusted sky. Then, a shape detached itself from the deeper shadows below. It was not a man. It was too tall, too thin, its limbs moving with a disjointed, unnatural grace. It didn't climb the stairs like a person, placing one foot after another. It flowed upwards, pulling its grotesque length from then, step to the next in a single, fluid motion, its form seeming to stretch and contract like cooling tar. It was the silhouette from the tree line, the man-shaped patch of darkness, but now it was in motion, and it was coming for me. As it drew closer, I could see that its form was not solid. It was a vortex of deeper blackness, its edges indistinct and wavering, seeming to absorb the faint starlight around it. There were no discernible features. No face, no clothes, no hands. Only a horrifying, shifting anatomy that my mind could not properly process. It was a living shadow, a tear in the fabric of the night. It reached the landing just below the cab. It stopped. For a terrifying moment, it was perfectly still. I could feel its attention, a palpable pressure against the glass, a cold, dead focus that was far more terrifying than any scream. The scratching beneath my feet stopped. The tower fell silent, save for the whisper of the wind and the frantic drumming of my own heart. Then, it raised a long, multi-jointed limb and tapped on the glass. Tap, a single, soft, almost polite sound. It was a mockery of the frantic pounding on the trapdoor. It was the sound of absolute confidence. I recoiled from the window, walking backwards until I hit the map table. My mind was a maelstrom of terror. I was going to die. The glass would shatter, and that thing would pour into the cab. My wild eyes fell upon the laminated list of rules, lying on the table next to the logbook. My sanctuary of rules had failed. They had kept me alive for 6 days. But now the monster was at the door. Tap. Tap. It was testing the glass, its touch sending tiny vibrations through the floor. The sound was maddeningly gentle. My gaze fell on Rule 25. From time to time, you may observe a sequence of lights hovering over the ridge to the north, known as Old Crow's Ridge. Do not look at them directly. They are a localized atmospheric phenomenon. A localized atmospheric phenomenon. Earl's Flat, unconvincing explanation. Ben had never mentioned the lights in his logbook. Maybe they hadn't appeared for him. Or maybe they were the key. A desperate, insane idea began to form in my shattered mind. What if the rules weren't just a list of prohibitions? What if they were instructions? What if the phenomenon was a weapon? I scrambled to the northern window, my back to the tapping creature. I stared out at the dark, jagged line of Old Crow's Ridge. It was just a black shape against a blacker sky. Nothing. The tapping on the western window stopped. I heard a soft, slithering sound, the noise of something immense dragging itself across the narrow, metal catwalk that encircled the cab. It was moving. It was coming around to the front. My eyes were glued to the northern ridge, praying for a miracle I couldn't even define. "Please," I whispered to the indifferent darkness. "Please." And then it happened. A single point of brilliant, emerald green light appeared above the ridge. It was utterly silent, impossibly bright. A moment later, a second light appeared next to it, a deep, vibrant sapphire. Then a third, the color of blood. They hovered in a perfect, straight line, pulsing with a slow, hypnotic rhythm. Rule 25 screamed in my head. Do not look at them directly. I tore my gaze away, my eyes smarting, spots of color dancing in my vision. The slithering sound outside had stopped. I risked a glance at the window where the shadow thing had been. It was gone. I turned back to the northern window, but kept my eyes averted, focusing on the reflection of the cab in the glass. In the reflection, I could see the thing. It was plastered against the southern window now, its form flattened and spread across the entire pane of glass like a giant black insect. And it was no longer looking at me. Its entire, featureless being seemed to be focused on the northern ridge, on the lights. It seemed afraid. The lights began to move. They broke their perfect formation and began to dance, weaving intricate, geometric patterns in the sky. They were beautiful and terrifying, a silent, cosmic ballad. As they danced, they grew brighter, their collective glow beginning to illuminate the interior of the cab. The creature on the window began to recoil. A low, guttural hiss emanated from it, a sound of pain and fury that vibrated through the glass. Its form started to waver, to lose its cohesion, as if the light were dissolving it. A desperate gamble, a choice. The rules were all I had. I remembered the Osborne firefinder on the map table, its polished brass surface a perfect, convex mirror. Without looking up, keeping my eyes fixed on the floor, I lunged for the firefinder. I angled its mirrored surface towards the northern window, catching the reflection of the dancing lights. Then I turned, aiming the reflected light like a weapon towards the southern window, where the creature was writhing. The moment the reflected, concentrated light hit the black form, it shrieked. It was not a sound made of air and vocal cords. It was a psychic scream that tore through my mind, a sound of pure agony and hatred. The creature convulsed violently, its form boiling and coming apart like ink in water. It detached from the glass and flung itself from the catwalk, a comet of dissolving shadow, plummeting into the darkness below. I collapsed to the floor, the firefinder clattering from my grasp. The psychic scream echoed in my skull. The lights over Old Crow's Ridge held. For another minute, their silent dance, reaching a final, brilliant crescendo, before winking out, one by one, plunging the world back into darkness. Silence. This time, the silence was real. The scratching was gone. The voice was gone. The thing on the stairs was gone. I was alone. Truly alone. I lay on the floor until the sun rose, a broken man in a glass box. The dawn was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. It wasn't just the end of the night. It was a confirmation that I had survived. When I finally found the strength to stand, I surveyed the cab. The trapdoor was savaged, the wood splintered and gouged. The glass on the southern window was smeared with a black, viscous residue that sizzled faintly in the morning light, before evaporating into a foul, smelling vapor. I was alive. The rules had saved me. But I understood now. They weren't just a list of warnings for a passive observer. They were the terms of engagement in a war I hadn't known I was fighting. This tower wasn't a prison. It was a listening post, a watchtower, an outpost on the front line, and the voice on the radio. Let me see your collection, archivist. My eyes fell to the chest under the cot, the one containing the old logbooks. Ben's frantic scrawl. The methodical entries of the men who came before him. Decades of testimony. A collection of witness statements. An archive of the impossible. That was my collection. That was what the darkness wanted. It didn't just want to kill the lookout. It wanted to erase the knowledge, to silence the witnesses, to wipe the official record clean. It wanted to make the history of this place disappear. I walked over to the chest and opened it. I took out the fresh logbook Earl had given me. I opened it to a new page. My hand was steady now. The fear was still there, a cold, hard stone in my gut, but it was overlaid with something new, a grim, resolute purpose. I was Arthur Callahan. I was the lookout. But that booming, monstrous voice had been right about one thing. I am the archivist, and my work has just begun.